Of course, the Eagles always making news. As we just got done talking to Jaws, who was on that committee. You have a piece up over at PhillyMag.com, Birds 24/7, that other people also think that Doug Peterson might be a wonderful coach. You know, just talked to Jaws. He seems to think that people will be very surprised by the job that Doug Peterson does. And he mentioned the way he's kind of handling the media at Media Day out there at the Combine.
Yeah, and one thing that I think has been a positive, at least from my eyes so far, about Doug Peterson, and just kind of limited interaction so far and what we've been able to talk to him about, is he's been very open to change. I think that's really where you can draw a line of distinction between him and Chip Kelly. Doug Peterson told us a good story yesterday about how in Kansas City, they went 11-5 that first year after 2 wins the year before. So by pretty much any measure, that's a pretty good turnaround. But Doug Peterson talked about how they made a huge mistake and that they tried to fit their players into their scheme rather than listen, to the players. And it kind of goes back to, fit, square pegs in a circle holes. And then they realized, okay, well, we need to listen to Alex Smith. We need to listen to Eric Berry, Justin Houston. And the reason that was brought up was because, Chip had these kind of very strict, measurements that he wanted his players to fit, kind of prototype at each position. And so Doug Peterson was asked, is that how, you're different? You don't have those prototypes. And so Doug Peterson kind of expanded it into the running back situation. And this is why I think I agree with Jaws that, you don't see that same kind of explosiveness and burst from DeMarco Murray. But I do think Doug Peterson will help DeMarco Murray because he said, the first thing I noticed of why DeMarco Murray had that drop-off is because, there were 3 running backs, but you were treating them as one. And it's funny because that's something we heard from Chip so much was, Ryan Matthews, DeMarco Murray, same running back. And Doug Peterson's like, well, you have 3 different running backs, 3 different styles. You should probably use plays that, tailor to the strengths of each player rather than just run the same play with each guy. And so I think that he's definitely more kind of adaptable than Chip, and I think that's one of the positive signs so far, and one thing that maybe he learned under Andy, or maybe that's just who he is. But that's one thing that I've kind of picked up on recently that I think bodes well for him.
Josh, give me your impressions of both Roseman and Peterson yesterday talking about Sam Bradford, negotiating, kind of with Bradford saying, hey, if he wants to be here, he has a spot. I guess the ball is now in Sam Bradford's court.
Yeah, and my impression from just talking to both of those guys is that, they've made it pretty clear that they want him back. Now, will they pay a ridiculous amount of money for him? No, but they will certainly make a competitive offer for him. A market value offer for him. And I think that it really is. If Sam Bradford has any desire to be back in Philadelphia, I think he will be. They've made it clear that, they've, talked to Tom Condon, his agent, and they told him, we'd like to have Sam back, obviously. But, Sam has to want to be here. And that's one thing that Doug Peterson touched on was the other side of it is Sam Bradford has to want to be in Philadelphia. And Doug Peterson seems to genuinely believe that Sam Bradford does want to be in Philadelphia. So I think it's more likely than not that Sam Bradford's back, and that's the kind of the direction that I see this heading.
Yeah, Josh Paunil, PhillyMag.com, Birds 24/7. The Combine is where the two guys spoke yesterday, and they're looking at a plethora of young players out there, word. Josh. And you look at the quarterback spot at the draft. What are you learning out about the quarterbacks in this particular draft class? It seems like a lot of people don't know what to think, that there's not a player like Winston or Mariota, so that the quarterbacks aren't as high profile, but it seems like there's a lot of depth.
Yeah, and that's the one thing that's been interesting is there obviously is no, Andrew Luck, Mariota-type guy who is clearly going to be, or people think is clearly a franchise quarterback who's going to be taken, number 1 or number 2 overall. But what some people are saying that I've heard is that although there's no guy, clear, franchise guy at the top, can't miss type guy, there is some more depth than there has been recently. And, there could be, 4 quarterbacks taken in the first round. the one thing, the Eagles are kind of in an interesting situation because number 13 overall, I mean, it seems kind of safe to say that Carson Wentz from North Dakota State, Jared Goff from California won't be there. They won't, kind of escape the top 10. And Paxton Lynch from Memphis, will he be there at number 13? So there's a lot of uncertainty about who will be there when the Eagles draft. But the other thing that I thought was interesting was Doug Peterson said that the kind of the observations and the takeaways that the Eagles come away from the combine with this week about this quarterback class won't have any bearing on what they do with Sam Bradford. I thought that was pretty interesting because, you would think that maybe if the Eagles were on the fence and they were super impressed by, multiple quarterbacks, they felt comfortable with they'd have a good option to draft, and maybe they wouldn't bring Bradford back. But they said, no, this won't have any bearing on what we do with Bradford. These are kind of two separate things. That was something that pretty much surprised me, to be honest.
Yeah, and, talk with Josh Paunil here at the draft there. Another thing that you guys had over at Philly Mag today, and I was talking about this on yesterday's show, the draft is an area where at number 13, there's only so many positions at 13. You're not, most likely you don't see a center or a guard a lot of times go in that spot. Yeah. And where Philadelphia is, they're kind of in an interesting spot. And one area I wonder about is safety. And there are a couple of high-profile safeties on the free agent market. Not a lot, but a couple of interesting names. And one at the top of that list is Eric Berry. Now, he could be franchised, but Chiefs, we always try to get the connections there. With the Eagles, if they're going to make a big splash in free agency, would that be the position that makes the most sense?
That's a good question. I think it would be probably between that or offensive line because quarterback, there really is no way to make a splash. It doesn't seem like there's really going to be anyone of, Sam Bradford will very likely, if he even made it to free agency, he would be the top guy. So I don't think you can even make a splash at the quarterback position. And then really when you go through the rest of the positions, offensive line and safety are definitely two positions, especially because this defense, with the transition to the 4-3, the addition of Jim Schwartz, I think that this defense, I think they're much closer to what they showed in the first half of last season than the second half of last season. Yeah. I think you're going to see that. I think the defensive line, especially Fletcher Cox, Benny Logan, I think they're really going to benefit from just the aggressiveness and not having to read and react and just go attack the ball. But that safety, that's going to be a big portion of can they be that defense in the first half of the season? Because if it's just Malcolm Jenkins and you don't really have a suitable replacement for Walter Thurmond, who it seems like it's more likely than not that Walter Thurmond won't be back in Philadelphia next season. So if you have a big drop off in that second safety spot, then that could really hurt you and prevent you from having that defensive unit that was so staunch as it was in the first half of last season.
Josh, let me get your thoughts on RG3. Some speculation that the Eagles could have some interest. I personally think he kind of gets a bad rap. He was dynamic. He accounted for 27 touchdowns and just 5 interceptions as a rookie, 7 rushing, 20 passing. He took a terrible Redskins franchise to an NFC East title. Seemed like unheard of that year. And then, no business being on the field in that game. And ever since then, it's been all downhill. But would he have some intrigue at if he was a much cheaper price than a Sam Bradford?
Yeah, and that's why I think it is reasonable to say, well, maybe the Eagles will bring in RG3, and that's because he's really kind of a low risk, potentially high reward type of guy. Because after the kind of tumultuous years that he's had recently, you're not going to have to pay a lot of money for him at all, and really, you could pay him, maybe even backup money. So he's a guy that you really aren't going to put a lot on the line to bring him in. And especially when you already have a guy like Mark Sanchez. If say you get rid of Mark Sanchez, you want to cut him to open up some more, a few $1 million more in the 2016 cap space, and maybe something doesn't work out with Sam Bradford. Bring him in. You're not going to pay him a lot. It's really, there's really, in my mind, minimal risk. So why not? If you think that he has any potential at all, then bring him in because you're not going to have to pay a lot of money for him.
Josh Paunil at Birds 24/7 at PhillyMag.com, where it's all Eagles all the time. And the Eagles' news this offseason has not taken a break. They have continued to pump things out, including releasing D'Amico Ryans yesterday, more from the Combine. And, Josh, man, always a pleasure. Great stuff.
Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.